Back in the early days of cars, engines would spin slowly. Maximum RPM were measured in single digits or less, with some engines taking days to complete one revolution. And then motorcycles came along. And almost overnight, engines went from slow-moving iron pigs to screaming fast aluminum and magnesium works of art. I have several of these magical pieces of motorcycle machinery, 2 of them not in motorcycles. 3 of these engines have the same problem. They don't want to rev past about 7,000 RPM. 7,000 is great for car engines from the late 1800s, but it's a sad sight for a modern bike engine. Fortunately for me, I have some experience in this area. I have technical knowledge of internal combustion engines that is on par with the accuracy of my historical knowledge of those engines. So join me as I go from 20,000 to 40,000 RPM. The reason I have 3 engines that don't want to rev up is pretty straightforward. They either all have a new ECU, new sensors, or are just new. The Grom has a new ECU, actually a newer version of the same ECU. The S600 has a new engine and therefore a few new sensors, notably the crankshaft sensor, and the land speed car has just never revved up correctly. Let's start with the easy one. The Grom engine is not an actual Grom engine, it is from a CBR 250R. The bike started with about 9 horsepower, but with the 250 it should be closer to 25, except it's not running correctly, so it's back to about 9. The Grom was originally powered by the ECU from the CBR, but since my intake is vastly different from the stock 250, the tuning was terrible. So I got a used micro squirt. This micro squirt came from a Lemons race car. It's about 15 years old. It's had a hard life. It worked well, but my engine started to sputter randomly after riding for about half an hour. I checked all the wiring and it seemed good, so I figured it might be time for an upgrade anyway. I called my friends over at DIYAutotune.com and got a new one. I wired it all up and started riding it around, but it wouldn't tune correctly. In fact, it wouldn't rev all the way up at all. I logged the data and realized it was getting a lot of crankshaft syncing errors, so I figured it must be something to do with the crankshaft sensor. I first tried swapping the 2 wires, but that didn't help. Then I added a resistor. That worked great. Here's what's going on. A VR sensor generates a voltage when you swing a piece of steel by it. So every time one of these teeth of the trigger wheel goes by, the sensor spits out a few volts for a split second. First, a negative voltage, then a positive, unless you hook up the wires backward, in which case it's a positive and then a negative. It doesn't actually matter as long as the ECU knows what it's looking for. Sometimes you get the engine running, but it runs like crap. You switch the 2 wires and it starts running great because it's looking for the up and not the down. Anyway, voltage. The ECU that came with this engine knows exactly what these voltage spikes look like at every RPM because BMW programmed it specifically for this sensor and trigger wheel. But aftermarket ECUs, like the micro squirt, can be used on any engine, and so they don't know exactly what voltage to trigger at. This becomes a problem on high revving engines because higher revs means higher voltage, so at a lot of RPMs you'll start to pick up these little noisy bits, and the ECU doesn't know what's going on. The solution? You bridge the 2 wires with a resistor. This sort of squishes the whole thing down so the noisy bits stay out of the ECU's perception. Anyway, I added the resistor. You can actually do this inside the ECU. You just solder these 2 pads together, but I didn't know that, so I added the resistor in line. In any case, it now revs all the way to 10,500 RPM. Done. Let's move on. I swapped the new engine into the S600 a few months ago. 6, apparently. Wow, that's a long time. And in that entire time, it has never revved over 7,000 RPM. Why? Because I've been busy with other stuff. The ECU is the same one as before, exactly the same. The engine is new, but the sensors work mostly the same. The camshaft sensor is exactly the same. I actually just moved it from the old engine to the new one. The crankshaft sensor is the same type of sensor and the same type of trigger wheel, so it should work out of the box, but it doesn't. I spent some time messing with the settings, and then I added that resistor across the 2 wires, but none of this worked. But then, instead of adding the resistor in parallel with the sensor, I added it in line. And then the S600 is using a later generation of Megasquirt than the Grom, so the VR sensor conditioner works a little bit differently. How does it work? Well, let me explain it to you. I don't know. It's different. I don't know. It's some electronic magic. Once I put the resistor in there and it fixed the problem, I stopped caring. Anyway, 2 engines down and 1 to go. This is super easy. This is going to be a short video.
But it would not be a short video. It would be a medium-length video.
I get a fair number of emails from companies asking about sponsored content on this channel. It's rare, but excellent when one of those companies has a service that I use and like. I've been using private internet access for a few years now, and it's great. Private internet access protects your data from the prying eyes of internet service providers, network administrators, the government, or any nefarious actors looking to profit off of your data. You can protect your browsing history by connecting to a local server in your area, or connect to one in a different country. Private internet access has servers all over the world and in every single US state. So if you want to see your hometown sports team, even though your local network has blocked it, if you want to check out geographically limited local news stories and videos while you're out of town, or if you just want to see a show that premieres in a different time zone first, you can do that. It works with all major streaming services and P2P file sharing. I like private internet access over the competition because it is totally transparent. In fact, it is the world's most transparent VPN provider. Help support the channel and also protect your data. It's even cheaper now than the last time, $2.03 a month for the 2-year plan, and you get an extra 4 months for free. Click that link in the description and give it a try. The engine in the land speed car is a BMW S1000RR, which normally revs to 14,300 RPM, but this one goes to about 7,000. I tried adding the resistor in parallel and that didn't do anything. I put one in series and that got me a few RPMs. I tried potentiometers in series and parallel so I could make an adjustable voltage divider. Then I tried revving up the engine while turning all these knobs, but nothing worked. I took out the VR sensor and put in a Hall effect sensor. This also did not work. Interestingly, I could start the engine and then slowly pull the sensor away from the gear at wide open throttle. This would rev the engine a little bit higher to just under 9,000 RPM, but then it would just die. Somebody on the forums had this exact same problem on the same bike engine, but either he never figured it out or he made the cardinal sin of forums. He did not go back and post his solution, even though he specifically told us he would. Here's the problem. BMW has this big gear here that allows the starter motor to turn the crankshaft. This gear is about 3 times wider than it needs to be. There's not that much torque going to it from the starter. BMW uses this gear as the crankshaft sensor trigger wheel. They ground down 2 of the teeth, but only partway through, and they only ground them down part way. So what's happening is that my ECU is seeing these little nubs here, or perhaps these bits of teeth here, and it's showing up as a tooth at higher RPM. So if I add that resistor, it should get rid of the noise, and it does, kind of. It allows me to get from 7,000 to 8,000 RPM. If I add a gigantic fat resistor, it pulls the signal down so far that the engine won't even start. If you're programming your own ECU like BMW, this is trivial. You just tell it to look for low voltage spikes at low RPM and high voltage spikes at high RPM. But I can't do that because I'm not programming my own ECU. I asked the team over at DIY AutoTune about this, and they suggested that I try to get rid of the little nubs left on the gear. This is difficult because it's hidden inside the engine, but I did figure out how to get to it. If you take the left side cover off, you can remove all the reduction gears from the starter motor and access the gear. So I did that, busted out the die grinder, and went to town. I did stuff a bunch of paper towels in there in an effort to keep my oil pan from becoming a wasteland of metal shavings. I also used a magnet to try to clean out as much as I could. I'm sure I missed some, but that's what oil filters are for. I hope that's what oil filters are for. Anyway, this didn't work. It worked a little, actually. I got the engine to rev up to a new top score of 9,000 RPM. With the gear cleaned up, I thought it might be time to try the resistors again. Maybe those little noise spikes were smaller now and I could filter them out. Unfortunately, my battery was dead because I had been cranking over and over, and also I may have left the car on for multiple days straight. Anyway, this is not a big deal because I have a neat little connector here that I made to connect my jumper cables for this exact issue. If you work with a race car for any amount of time, you will have a dead battery. It's just the way it is. Anyway, I hooked up the jumper cables to my Forerunner and turned around to see the magic smoke.
Looks like them Superfast boys are in a heap of trouble.
As it turns out, if you hook up the black wire to the red terminal and the red wire to the black terminal, this happens. Not to get too technical, but electronics are assembled at the factory with a specific amount of what is sometimes called magic smoke. The magic smoke is necessary for the proper function of electronics, and when it gets out, it's gone. There's no putting it back in. This was pretty dumb on my part, but it was 3 days into a COVID infection and several days into prodding this thing with electrons to try to make it work, so I was functioning at about 40%, which is a full 3% lower than normal. Unfortunately, this totally fried my PDM, which is a bummer, but not the end of the world. I grabbed a fuse block and relay I had lying around and wired up the dummy version. Anyway, I really need 2 separate fuse blocks, but I had this one, so I just cut the bus bar in half and ran a new wire in from the top. After that, I wired in the resistor, revved it up, and no luck. Normally, this would be super frustrating, but I had just found out that the race I was trying to get to had been canceled due to rain, just like the previous one, and the one before that, and the one before that. So I had a whole 6 months to forget this car existed before frantically trying to fix it at the last minute before the first race next year. But I didn't wait 6 months. I wanted to solve this now. The way I saw it, there were 3 possible options. 1, I could swap out the OEM sensor with a new, narrower sensor. This would allow me to move it to the edge of the gear, hopefully missing those 2 partial teeth on the side. I can't get rid of those because they have to be there for the starter to work. 2, I could straight up remove the alternator assembly and put a big trigger wheel in there. I don't really need to be generating electricity for this thing. The car will only ever be running for a few minutes at a time. The third idea, and the one I went with, was to solve this problem with the power of send, cut, send. Remember those guys? I haven't laser cut anything in a while, which is weird because that's usually the solution to all of my problems. But I had an idea. I scanned the right side cover and drew up a new cover that would hold a Hall effect sensor. I did this in 2 pieces so I can take the outer cover off and see the gears inside. I need to do this because this is how you see if the engine is at top dead center or not. There are 2 dots, one on this lower gear and one on the upper gear. When they are both lined up with each other, you are at top dead center on cylinder number 1. You can flash a timing light at this and see if your ignition timing is right while the engine is running, but only if you can see it, so I made a removable cover. Hopefully, no oil comes out of this while it's running. I also designed a trigger wheel to go on the side of the crankshaft. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of room in here. To get the right width and the right spacing for the teeth, I could only get 12 teeth in there. 11, actually, there are spaces for 12, but 1 is missing. I even had to go in and cut away some of the aluminum for clearance, adding even more metal shavings into my oil pan. The engine originally had 58 teeth, or 60 with 2 missing. I'm assuming 11 is enough because that's what Honda is using on the engine in this thing. The goofy thing about this setup is that I don't really have a way to attach the trigger wheel to the crankshaft, so I'm just going to weld it to this bolt right here. I don't actually know if this is a bolt or how it's threaded on. It doesn't show up as a separate part on the parts diagram. You just buy the whole crankshaft with this gear and bolt already on there, but I don't want it to loosen or move, so I just tack welded the bolt to the crankshaft, then tack welded the trigger wheel to the bolt. Is this a good idea? I don't know. Let's find out. With it all wired up, I had to set the timing. I could have turned the engine over by hand and checked it with a degree wheel, but it's easier to just shine the timing light at the side, crank the engine over, and just adjust the numbers until it works. Also, I can't get a socket in the side anymore to turn the engine over by hand. Getting this right was a total pain. The trigger wheel I put in there was obscuring the dimple on the gear behind it. I thought to myself, I should have put a dimple on the trigger wheel in front of the gear dimple, and then I thought, wait a minute, I did that. It's right there. I love it when I have a great idea that I forgot I already had. I also added a Sharpie mark to make it a little more obvious. With the timing correct, I let the engine warm up. Then I remembered I should probably open the garage so I don't die of carbon monoxide poisoning. But then once it got up to temp, I shut it off and let the garage air out with the doors open. I closed the doors again for the actual rev test because this thing is wide open. Remember that muffler I had on there before? This was actually borrowed from the Grom, and the Grom is running now. So I don't have a muffler, it's wide open, and this thing is super loud. With the garage doors closed, the new 12-tooth crankshaft trigger wheel, and the new Hall effect sensor, I gave it the beans. And I got back all the beans. Success! 14,300 RPM. It works. No need to do an offset crank sensor. No need to remove the generator and place in a new trigger wheel. But there was one thing left to do. I need to verify that the timing is not walking around. This happens sometimes when you don't have enough resolution on the trigger wheel. At high revs, the engine will bounce around a few degrees. This is bad if you have a lot of advance. It might just jump a few degrees and start knocking, losing power and possibly damaging the engine. So to test this, I took off the plate here so I can see the timing marks. Then I put the timing light on the ground, propping it up to point it in the right place. I also set up my camera to record. This worked great up to about 8,000 RPM, and then the engine just started absolutely barfing oil out the sight hole. Just a torrent of oil. Ruined my shoes. I like these shoes, and now they're ruined. But the timing did seem to stay stable up until the oil completely obscured my view of the timing marks, so we'll call it good. Good enough anyway. And that's it, they all rev 10,500 RPM, 13,000 RPM, and 14,200 RPM, for a total of about 40,000 RPM. Close enough. Wait a minute. Oh, keep going. 50,000, keep it going. 60,000 RPM, woo! All right, that's enough. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.